Yeah, I think the last time that the Prime Minister visited New Zealand, she made it clear that for Samoa, it's just a matter of making sure that the scheme is still working as it was intended from all parties' perspective. We want the RSE scheme to benefit both Samoa and New Zealand, and what Samoa has identified is that in some cases where it was primarily intended to be an employment opportunity for those in Samoa who are unemployed, it has increasingly over time taken skilled labour out of Samoa. We're very open to working with Samoa to make sure it works for them, because that will work for us.
What can you do though?
It will very much come down to the way that the scheme works up front in identifying workforce on the Samoa end, which is why we've said to them, look, we're here to work alongside you, but it's really a matter for the processes that they want to see happening in country. One thing we have highlighted is there's often existing relationships where we've had workers on repeat occasions coming back into New Zealand, and that's just something to be mindful of as we work through this.
Why didn't we see anything concrete around the RSE scheme today?
Oh, because ultimately it's really for Samoa. They've indicated that they want to give at their cabinet level a bit of consideration to how the scheme works for them in the future, and so we await the outcome of that. We do still have workers moving into the RSE scheme at the moment. In fact, we have a higher number of Samoan RSE workers in New Zealand than we usually would, but we're totally respectful of the fact that Samoa wish to go through this process. My view is that the RSE scheme will continue. It's just making sure that we give Samoa a bit of time to see how it's working for them as they recover from COVID and as they seek not to lose too much of their skilled workforce.
You mentioned doing more. The move to make that climate change funding flexible funding for Samoa to prioritise.
We have said all the way through when it comes to the climate financing that we want to work alongside the Pacific with their priorities. They're best placed to identify what are the most pressing issues. You know, for Samoa, they've already said that renewable energy is one, but also flood protections. As they've had more development up into the inner part of the island, they're seeing some of the impacts of that when there are heavy rains into the coastal areas. So working with them on those things that will provide greater resilience to mitigation and mitigation.
You mentioned looking at areas around economic development more with Samoa. What does that look like practically? So is that, for example, rebuilding the market, they request money for certain areas like that, and then New Zealand helps out?
We do want to take a partnership approach. You know, here the government is best placed to identify where those economic development opportunities exist. One area has been the rebuild of the market that particularly has affected small business owners and women. And as tourism looks to return, it's been previously a significant part of their tourism profile here. It's been the place where people have been able to, yes, buy agricultural products, but also cultural items as well. So as they've identified that as being a really critical piece of infrastructure, it's an area where we can come in and support the redevelopment of that marketplace.
On that marketplace specifically, talking to locals and business owners there, and that used the word lifeline.
Yeah.
What was your sense when you spoke to the Samoan Prime Minister about how significant that market is to this local economy?
I mean, many New Zealanders who have visited Samoa, of course, the diaspora in New Zealand, they know that marketplace. It is part of the economy here. Locals and tourists visit that place. So, yes, we for ourselves can see that it's incredibly important. And then, of course, the government have also identified it as being important. Ultimately, I think the reason there's been a delay from the fact that it was destroyed by fire in 2016 and the fact that they're now looking at the rebuild is because the previous government had an alternate plan to relocate the market elsewhere. The new government has decided no, they'd like to redevelop it in its original site. That decision now enables us to come forward and support that priority.
The Prime Minister alluded to some discussions, I think it might have been even in one-on-one, around regionalism. Can you update us on the post-PIF talks that you've had in that space? I guess Fiame was obviously a member of the parties to the Suva agreement. Is there any update on Micronesia particularly?
No, not particularly. In fact, I think that demonstrates that PIF was a chance to really settle some of those issues. The Suva agreement had the broad support of the Pacific Island Forum. Yes, Kiribati continues to sit outside at their choosing, but all sides have said the door remains open. I think one of the things that we reflected on together was that as a result of that Pacific Island Forum, New Zealand often hasn't been part of a formal sub-regional group. fact, New Zealand and Australia have often not necessarily being identified within those sub-regions, but being slightly out there on their own. As a result of that meeting, it has been decided that New Zealand now sits within the Polynesia sub-regional group and Australia in Melanesia. You know, that actually gives us an opportunity to work more closely within our region on issues within the PIF. So not a lot of fanfare around that, but I think that's a significant outcome.
What does it say that it hasn't been any sort of breakthrough or any sort of negotiations about Micronesia, noting, of course, that there's no new addition to that Micronesia?
Well, it is only Kiribati here at this point that have decided that the Suva agreement doesn't satisfy their concerns. I wouldn't necessarily expect in just the short weeks after for them to have concluded their next decision, but I think the outcome is the door is open on both sides.
Minister, speaking to local businesses this morning, they said the COVID lockdown here showed that maybe Samoa is too reliant on New Zealand for tourism and the RSE scheme. Do you think there's some truth to that, and what can New Zealand do to help grow its independence?
I think every economy in the aftermath of COVID has been looking at how they can build greater resilience to the shocks that can be caused by, be it a pandemic or the economic shock of the recovery in the aftermath. And so whether or not that means ensuring that we have, you know, on New Zealand's part, strong domestic tourism, or in Samoa's case, resilience to any future shocks around international tourism. So no country, I think, is in the aftermath sitting back and not reflecting on how we can each build that greater resilience.
What makes a 24-hour trip like this worth it, and do you feel like this has met that threshold?
This is an incredibly important milestone for both Samoa and New Zealand. We do not have a treaty of this nature with anyone else. New Zealand has a particular history here as well. And so whether or not it's 24 hours or a week, the ability to come here, renew and recommit to the treaty, but also actually be able to have a dialogue with Cabinet, which is rare as well, can be as productive as if we were here for days.
Minister, a question from importers back home. Why is the government using its majority to push through the Oranga Tamariki oversight bill when there's been so much opposition, both from experts and those who've gone from stake here?
We have the Minister here, so I think what I might do is I think I might get the Minister to conclude. So do you mind if I just canvass around and get some final questions on anything else anyone has for me? Do any of our Pacific media?
I was just going to say this kind of trip is really significant, and the leader usually leaves with a matai title. So have you been offered a chiefly title at all, Prime Minister?
No, and this actually has, on each of my visits, this has been a topic of conversation, and I think it's fair to say that I go with the flow. But at the same time, I'm always very humbled to be here, to lead a delegation here. And when it comes to what is most appropriate culturally, I am in the hands of the hosts.
In the wider region,
Do you mind if I just come here as well, Chris? Yeah, and then I'll come to you.
Prime Minister Fiamere said that with the bilateral discussions, they were in line with the theme of lifelong friends.
Yeah.
I mean, how is that able to be the case in the cabinet room where you have cross-party representation across all the parties?
There's actually a number of issues on that won't be party political, and in fact, I think it's useful from time to time to have the opportunity for those other party leaders to be a part of and hear from the perspective of the Samoan government, their view on issues like, for instance, skills, like, for instance, education and health and climate priorities. Because whilst the government in New Zealand will be the ultimate decision maker, we know that political cycles are just that, they're cycles, and it is good to have continuity of those relationships and priorities.
In the wider Pacific, we see concerns around Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. Do you think that could lead to instability or some safety concerns?
Look, I wouldn't wish to step into the decisions of other nations around their bilateral engagements. Those are matters for them. When it comes to generally, increasingly a contested region, including South China Sea or issues around the Taiwan Strait, here we will continue to call for diplomacy and dialogue to work through those issues. I was heartened to hear that President Biden and President Xi had such a long conversation recently. That's the kind of dialogue I think that will stand us in good stead in the future.
One word to describe this trip.
Oh, yeah, and then I'll finish with a word, and then we'll finish with Minister Sepuloni.
Described issues regarding to movement of people between New Zealand and Samoa. She raised those with you. You've made concessions, or you're going to work with them on movement of diplomats and politicians. Is there a willingness to make it easier for everyday Samoans to visit, travel, move to New Zealand?
So we did discuss the issue of mobility, and one of the competing issues here is that, of course, on the Samoa side, yes, the issue of it becoming easier for movement, but at the same time a desire to retain skills. And so the way it's perhaps better phrased is, how do we ensure that we have a cycle? So not the long-term departure and loss of those skills. I think that's where there is room for us to talk about how we can improve that. We have the PACER Plus work on mobility. I think that's a really good forum for us to expand on that conversation. And as you say, we do think as a starting point we can make it easier for diplomats and politicians.
Does it have to be one-way movement as well? Could it be some New Zealanders moving to Samoa?
Well, I think that, of course, for short-term movements, New Zealanders have a bit more ease of passage. But no, it shouldn't just be one way. We should think about reciprocal arrangements. In fact, the practice is for New Zealand that we always seek reciprocal arrangements. I'll finish there. My one word would be, well, it's hard, warm and productive. You know, we have in a short space of time continued on some important work. We've got some significant projects we've launched today. But at the same time, it's been in the spirit of friendship, so warm and productive. I'll let the Minister then finish.
Okay.
Do you want me to throw that one?
Yeah, could you?
So, question from back home. Why is the government using its majority to push through the Oranga Tamariki oversight bill despite widespread concern and criticism from experts and also kids that have gone through state court?
Yeah, we've traversed that bill quite extensively, and we need to move ahead. We were told through the BD report that we needed to act with urgency to get the oversight system in place. And I think there is some confusion out there with respect to what is actually in the bill. I'm looking forward to the committee stages in the House, to be honest, so that we can pick it apart and have a real debate about what's in front of us. But it is important that we formalise the system for the sake of the rangatahi.
Is it something you'd consider pausing, the progress of it?
We have no plans to pause it.
And why scrap the Children's Commissioner?
We're not scrapping the Children's Commissioner. This is one of the misconceptions around the legislation. It will have a board that bolsters the support and advocacy at the Children's Commission. There will still be a Chief Children's Commissioner. On that board, we're looking to have representation from important stakeholders, Māori, disability, people with care experience. And so we're not scrapping the Children's Commission or the Commissioner. We are actually bolstering their ability to advocate.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.